The receipts were right there on the kitchen counter, fanned out like a hand of cards nobody wanted to be dealt. I remember standing in my own kitchen in early March, still wearing my work apron, the one that smelled like espresso and steamed milk, staring at a paper trail that made absolutely no sense. A greenhouse, fence panels, delivery confirmation to an address I didn't recognize. And at the top of the first receipt, a total that matched almost exactly the personal loan I had taken out 2 months earlier. $12,000, every cent of it, gone to something I had never agreed to, never even heard about until that moment. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, one hand flat on the counter, listening to the little bubbling hum of the aquarium in the corner of the living room, the one with the neon tetras and the 2 small angelfish my husband Garrett and I had set up together years ago. That sound had always been calming to me, background noise of a stable life. But right then it felt like it was mocking me. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother-in-law, Diane. She answered on the second ring, and what I told her changed everything. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the 18 years that came before it. Garrett and I met when I was 26 and he was 29. I was working at a small cafe in the coastal town of Pelican Cove, which sits on a stretch of Carolina shoreline where the off-season is grey and quiet, and the tourists show up every summer like clockwork, turning the whole place loud and golden. I had grown up 2 towns over and ended up in Pelican Cove almost by accident. Took a job at saltwater grounds after a relationship fell apart and I needed somewhere new. I figured I'd stay 6 months. I stayed the rest of my life. Garrett was a contractor, local guy, 3rd generation in the area. He came in every morning for a large dark roast with no room, and for about 3 weeks he barely said anything beyond his order and a polite thanks. Then one Tuesday in February, he asked me what I was reading during my break, and I held up the book, some dense, badly reviewed literary novel I was determined to finish. And he said, "Is it worth it?" I said, "Absolutely not, but I'm too far in to quit." He laughed, genuine, surprised. That was it. That was the whole beginning. We got married on a Saturday in June, 2 years later, on the deck of a friend's waterfront property. Nothing fancy, 60 people, a catered fish fry, string lights that kept blinking out because of a bad connection. Perfect. For years, things were genuinely good. Not Instagram perfect, not without arguments and tight months and the occasional week where we barely talked because we were both exhausted, but solid, real. Garrett's contracting work kept us comfortable. I stayed at Saltwater Grounds because I genuinely loved it. The rhythm of the morning rush, the regulars who told me things they probably didn't tell their therapists, the particular satisfaction of pulling a perfect shot. I was 44 now, 17 years into that job, and I was good at it. Head barista, occasional shift supervisor. Not glamorous, not lucrative, but mine. We owned a small house 3 blocks from the water, 2 bedrooms, a sun porch we'd converted into a sitting room, and that aquarium, a 55-gallon tank that had started as Garrett's project and slowly became something we both cared about. We'd lost fish over the years, replaced them, learned which species survived our imperfect water chemistry. Currently we had 6 neon tetras, 2 angelfish named nothing in particular, because Garrett thought naming fish was asking for heartbreak, and a small bristle-nosed pleco that worked the glass like a janitor on overtime. Garrett's sister Renee was the person I should have paid more attention to from the start. She was 41, 2 years younger than Garrett, unmarried, and she had lived her entire adult life in that same coastal town. She worked part-time at a real estate office doing administrative work and spent the rest of her time orbiting her mother. Diane was 70, recently widowed. Garrett's father had passed a little over 2 years ago, and she lived about 20 minutes inland in a house with a big yard that had gotten harder and harder for her to manage. Renee was not obviously terrible. That's the thing I want you to understand. She wasn't rude to my face. She showed up to our place for holidays with store-bought pie and a smile. She remembered my birthday most years. But there was something underneath all of that, a low-frequency signal I had been picking up for years without being able to name it clearly. Renee and Garrett talked constantly. multiple times a day. She had opinions about his business, his schedule, his finances. And over the years, those opinions had started to find their way into our living room, our dinner conversations, our arguments. It started small, the way it always does. About 3 years into our marriage, Renee mentioned to Garrett that I probably wasn't ambitious enough to keep up with his career growth. He told me about it casually, like it was funny, like it was just Renee being Renee. I laughed it off. 5 years in, she suggested through Garrett that we should put her name on our emergency contact forms because she was more available than my own sister who lived in Raleigh. Garrett thought it was practical. I thought it was strange, but I let it go. 10 years in, she started calling Garrett to discuss their mother's finances, which was reasonable, I told myself. Their father had just been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. Family was pulling together. Normal. Except it was never just one thing. It was always one thing on top of another, slowly, until the weight of all of it was sitting on my chest, and I couldn't quite explain why I felt so squeezed. The financial piece had been building the longest, and I'd been the slowest to see it. Garrett's contracting business had slowed down after his father got sick. He'd taken time off, turned down jobs, and when his father finally passed, there was an estate to deal with, debts to sort through, and Diane suddenly needed more support, practical, emotional, and financial. I understood all of that. I genuinely did. Grief does things to people. I gave Garrett room. I picked up extra shifts. I stopped mentioning the vacation we'd been planning to take to the Outer Banks. I watched our savings account hover and then slowly start to drop. Then last fall, Garrett brought up the nursery. Not a baby nursery, a garden nursery. He said Diane had always wanted to expand her backyard. She'd grown up gardening, it was her thing. And since his father died, she'd been talking about doing something real with that big yard of hers. He said there was a local contractor willing to do the work cheap if we could help with materials. He said it would mean a lot to his mum. He said he wanted to do something good for her. I thought about it for about a week. Then I said yes. I took out a personal loan in my name, $12,000, at an interest rate that made my stomach hurt a little every time I thought about it. The plan, as Garrett had laid it out, was straightforward. The money would pay for raised garden beds, soil, irrigation, some basic fencing along the back of Diane's property, and a small shed-style structure where she could store tools and start seedlings in the spring. A nursery, something she could tend and love. I pictured Diane in rubber gardening gloves, happier than she'd been in 2 years. I signed the paperwork. That was in January. By early March, first week, the kind of cold, damp March that Pelican Cove specializes in, where the fog sits on the water until noon and the streets smell like salt and wet pavement, I came home from a double shift to find an envelope on the counter. Garrett wasn't home. The envelope had already been opened, which wasn't unusual. We didn't keep mail secrets. But inside was a receipt from a company called Blue Ridge Structures, and another from a supplier called Carolina Outdoor Solutions, and a third from a fencing company out of Asheville. I read them slowly. Blue Ridge Structures, custom greenhouse, 16 by 24 feet. Carolina Outdoor Solutions, raised cedar panels, tempered glass inserts, ventilation hardware. Fencing company, 200 linear feet of pressure-treated wood privacy fencing, installed. The total across all 3 receipts, $11,840. I stood there so long the aquarium light clicked over to its nighttime setting, and the tank went dim. The angelfish drifted. The tetras moved in their small, synchronized cloud. A greenhouse. Not a nursery in the garden beds and a potting shed sense, an actual glass-panelled greenhouse, the kind that cost serious money and required a foundation. And 200 feet of privacy fencing, none of which Garrett had described to me, none of which I had agreed to, all of which had been purchased with the money I had borrowed, that was in my name, that I was paying back at a rate of $312 a month for the next 4 years. I pulled out my phone and I texted Garrett. "Where are you? We need to talk." He replied 11 minutes later. "At Mum's, finishing something up, be home by 8. I set the phone down, picked it up again, and then I did something that I hadn't planned to do. I scrolled to Diane's number, not Renee's, Diane's, and I pressed call. She picked up after 3 rings. I could hear the television in the background, some evening news program, and the particular quiet of her house. "Ashley, honey," she said, surprised but warm. "Everything okay?" I looked at the receipts spread across my counter. I looked at the aquarium. I breathed once, slowly. "Diane," I said, "I'm looking at some paperwork and I need to ask you something directly. I need to know exactly what was built at your house and who authorized it and who paid for it." There was a pause, a longer one than I expected. "Well," she said carefully, "Renee told me Garrett had it all sorted out." And there it was, not Garrett's voice, Renee's name. I asked Diane to describe what was in her backyard right now. She did. The greenhouse, the fencing, the beautiful new structure that Renee had apparently been planning for months, that Renee had apparently been coordinating with the contractor, that Renee had apparently told Diane was Garrett's gift to her. Garrett's gift. With my loan. With my $12,000 and my name on the debt. "Diane," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "Did Garrett or Renee ever mention that I took out a personal loan for this? In my name?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," she said quietly. "No, Ashley, nobody told me that." I thanked her. I told her I'd call her again soon, and when I hung up, I sat down on the kitchen floor, right there on the tile, back against the cabinet, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was beginning to understand. This wasn't a miscommunication. This wasn't Garrett forgetting to mention a few upgraded features. This was $12,000 of my debt, my credit score, my 4 years of monthly payments, funneled into a project that Renee had designed, that Renee had orchestrated, that Garrett had either known about fully or had been too weak to stop. And I was the one left holding the bill. I heard his truck pull into the driveway at 7:52. I was still sitting on the floor. I got up, smoothed my apron, I hadn't even taken it off yet, and I picked up the receipts. When Garrett walked through the door, he took one look at my face and stopped. "You asked me to take out a loan to fix up the nursery, so I did," I said. My voice was quiet, controlled, careful in the way that quiet gets when it's holding something enormous underneath it. "But why do the receipts show a greenhouse and fence panels?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Look, my mum just said—" "I already called your mum," I said. The colour shifted in his face. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something else, something that looked a lot like the realization that the story he'd been planning to tell me had just lost its foundation. I set the receipts on the counter between us and waited. Garrett didn't move for a long moment. He just stood there in the doorway with his jacket still on, keys dangling from his hand, looking at the receipts on the counter like they were something that might bite him if he got too close. "Ash," he started. "Don't," I said. "Don't do the thing where you say my name like I'm overreacting before I've even said anything." He came into the kitchen slowly, set his keys down on the hook by the door, that automatic habitual gesture that I'd watched him make 10,000 times, and for some reason that small, normal thing made my chest hurt worse than anything else. He pulled out a chair and sat down. I stayed standing. "Renee found a company that could do the whole structure," he said finally. "She said it would be better for Mum long term, more insulated, more functional." "A 16 by 24 greenhouse, Garrett. I know what it is. Do you? Because what you described to me was garden beds and a potting shed, a place your mum could start seedlings and store her trowels. That's what I agreed to. That's what I borrowed $12,000 for." He rubbed his face with both hands. "It kind of evolved." "It evolved," I repeated. The word felt slippery and wrong in my mouth. "Into a custom greenhouse with tempered glass inserts and 200 feet of privacy fencing. That evolved." The fencing was so she'd have privacy from the Harmon property next door. Mum's been complaining about that for 2 years. "I know she has. I've heard her complain about it too. But that doesn't explain why you let me sign a loan agreement without telling me what the money was actually going toward." He looked up at me then. His face was doing something complicated. Not quite guilt, not quite defensiveness. Something in between that I'd seen before but never quite catalogued until now. It was the look of someone who had told himself a story about a situation and was only now beginning to feel the edges of that story not quite fitting. "Renee said you wouldn't go for it if I laid out all the details up front," he said. I stood very still. "She said that. She said you'd focus on the cost and not see the bigger picture. So your sister decided I needed to be managed, and you agreed with her." He didn't answer right away, and that pause was its own answer. I turned away from him and looked at the aquarium. The bristle-nosed pleco was working its way along the bottom glass, steady and methodical, and completely indifferent to everything happening in that kitchen. I envied it genuinely. "How long has Renee been planning this?" I asked. "She started talking to the contractor in October." October. Before Garrett had even brought up the nursery idea to me. Before any of the conversations we'd had about Diane's yard and what would make her happy, Renee had already made the calls, already gotten the quote, already decided. All that was left was figuring out how to get the money. And Garrett had gone along with it, shaped the story just enough to get me to sign the paperwork, and then handed the funds over to his sister, like I wasn't even a variable worth accounting for. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I said, "I need you to sleep in the sun porch tonight," and I walked to our bedroom and I closed the door. I lay on top of the covers in the dark for what felt like a long time. I could hear him moving around in the house. The television came on low, then went off. The refrigerator hummed. The aquarium bubbled. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up at 4:17 a.m. with all the lights off and the specific, hollow feeling of having slept badly in my clothes. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, looked at myself in the mirror for a minute. I was 44 years old. I had crow's feet and a small scar on my chin from a bicycle accident when I was 9, and the particular look around the eyes of someone who had been awake, crying, without quite realizing they were doing it. I looked like myself. I felt like someone had taken a seam ripper to a hem I'd spent years sewing. I went back to the bedroom, changed into actual pajamas, and lay back down. I did not sleep again. I lay there and I thought. The next 3 days were the worst kind of bad. Not dramatic, not loud, just quietly, thoroughly awful. Garrett and I moved around each other in the house like we were learning a new choreography neither of us had chosen. He apologized twice. The first time was the morning after, standing in the kitchen while I made coffee, and it was the kind of apology that was really a request for things to go back to normal. "I should have been more upfront with you, Ash. I'm sorry." And it landed nowhere near the actual wound. The second was 2 nights later, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and that one was longer and more careful, and he said he'd let Renee have too much influence, that he knew that he'd been trying to make his mother happy and hadn't thought through what it cost me. That one landed closer, but it still didn't explain why he'd let me believe a different story. It didn't explain the management of me that Renee had proposed and he had accepted. I went to work. I pulled espresso shots. I steamed milk. I talked to the regulars, a retired schoolteacher named Hal, who came in every morning at 6:45 and always asked how I was doing in a way that suggested he actually wanted to know. A young woman named Priya, who was doing a graduate degree remotely and camped at the corner table for 4 hours every Tuesday with her laptop. The usual rotation of contractors and parents and people on their way somewhere else. I smiled. I was competent and warm and professional. Then I drove home, and I sat with the weight of $12,000 in my name and 4 years of payments at $312 a month, and I thought about the fact that I had never seen the greenhouse. I hadn't been to Diane's house since Christmas. I didn't even know exactly what it looked like. On the 4th day, I drove out to see it. I didn't tell Garrett. I went after my morning shift, still in my work clothes, drove the 20 minutes inland on the 2-lane that cuts through the scrub pines. Diane's house is a rancher on about 1/3 of an acre, pale yellow siding, a long flat yard that backs up to a tangle of woods. I'd always liked it out there. Quieter than Pelican Cove. The air smelled different, less salt, more pine resin and red clay. I pulled into the driveway. Diane's car was there. I sat for a moment, then got out. She opened the door before I knocked. She must have heard the car. She looked at me, really looked at me, the way you look at someone when you've been thinking about them, and she stepped back to let me in without saying anything. I followed her through the house and out the back door, and there it was. It was actually beautiful. That was the thing that made it harder. A full glass panel greenhouse, the cedar framing still pale and new, the glass catching the thin March light. Inside I could see shelving units along the walls, grow lights hanging from the ceiling, a work surface down the centre. The privacy fence ran the full length of the back property line, boards tight and straight, the kind of installation that looked like it would outlast the house. Renee had good taste, I'd give her that. She'd built something real and lasting and lovely, with money that wasn't hers to use. She comes out here every morning, Diane said quietly from beside me. Renee, I mean. She's been starting seeds, tomatoes, peppers, some herbs. I looked at her. Renee comes here every morning. Most mornings, she has a key. I absorbed that. Renee had built herself a greenhouse. At her mother's house, yes, but a greenhouse she had access to daily, that she had designed and planned and controlled from the beginning. And she had used my name and my credit and my income to do it. Diane, I said, I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. I need you to understand that clearly. She nodded. Her eyes were bright and a little watery. I didn't know Ashley. I thought it was Garrett's doing. His idea, his money. Renee told me he'd handled everything. I never asked questions I should have asked. I know, that's not on you. She reached over and put her hand on my arm, brief and warm. What are you going to do? I looked at the greenhouse one more time, at the cedar frame and the tempered glass and the 200 feet of fence that had my signature on the debt behind them. I'm going to find out what my options are, I said. That was the moment. Not the night with the receipts, not the conversation with Garrett, not even the phone call to Diane. This was it, standing in that backyard in my coffee-stained work apron, looking at something built with my money that I had no say in, and deciding that I was not going to absorb this and move on. Something in me went from hurt and stunned to something colder and more precise. I had spent 17 years perfecting the art of patience and accommodation, of picking up extra shifts and letting things go and giving people room. I was very good at it, and I was done letting that skill be used against me. I drove home and I did two things. The first was that I called my sister Margot in Raleigh. We talked for an hour. She was the only person outside of Garrett and Diane who knew about the loan. I'd mentioned it when I took it out, casually, just as something I was doing. Now I told her everything. The receipts, the greenhouse, Renee's name, the October timeline. Margot is a paralegal. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural state, and when I finished she said, "Okay, you need to talk to someone who handles financial disputes, and possibly a family law attorney, depending on what you decide about Garrett." I don't know what I've decided about Garrett. That's fine, but don't make any decisions without knowing what your legal position is. The loan is in your name. That's leverage, and it's also exposure. You need to understand both before you do anything. I wrote down the name of an attorney she recommended, a woman in Wilmington who handled civil disputes and family law both, someone Margot had worked with professionally. Her name was Patricia Odom. I wrote it on the back of a receipt, not one of the greenhouse receipts, a different one. The second thing I did was go to our shared laptop and pull up our bank accounts, all of them. Checking, savings, the joint credit card. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking for a pattern. It took me about 40 minutes, and what I found was this. Over the past 14 months, there had been 11 transfers from our joint checking account to an account I didn't recognize. Small amounts, between $200 and $600 each. Nothing that would flag as alarming on its own. Together, they added up to $4,150. I sat back in the chair. The greenhouse loan was in my name, but those transfers were from our joint account. Money that belonged to both of us, moved somewhere I'd never seen or agreed to. I didn't know yet where it had gone. I didn't know if it was Garrett acting alone or Garrett at Renee's direction, but I knew I was going to find out. I took screenshots, all 11 transfers with dates and amounts. I sent them to my personal email. Then I printed them on our home printer, folded them, and put them in my bag alongside the greenhouse receipts. I was still sitting at the desk when I heard Garrett's truck in the driveway. I didn't close the laptop. He came through the door the way he always did, boots first, a little heavy on the left side from an old knee injury that had never healed quite right. He stopped when he saw the laptop open on the desk, the bank statements on the screen, and me sitting in the chair not pretending to be doing anything else. "Ashley," he said. "Sit down, Garrett." He sat. I turned the laptop toward him so he could see the screen clearly. 11 transfers, I said. 14 months. $4,150. Where did that money go? He looked at the screen for a long time. Long enough that I started to understand the length of the pause itself was information. "It was for Renee," he said finally. I had suspected it. Knowing it still felt like stepping on a stair that wasn't there. "For Rennie," I repeated. "She had some bills. After she cut her hours at the realty office, I was helping her out. From our joint account, without telling me. I kept meaning to tell you. Garrett," I stopped, breathed. "You kept meaning to tell me for 14 months. He didn't have an answer for that. He just sat there with his hands flat on the table, and I looked at those hands. Hands I'd watched frame window openings and replace tile and fix the aquarium pump when it seized up, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Something quieter and sadder, like watching a house you loved show its foundation cracks all at once. I called Patricia Odom the next morning. Her office was in Wilmington, about 45 minutes up the coast, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. She was a small woman, early 60s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had the particular manner of someone who had heard every variation of every bad situation and was not going to be shocked by mine. That was exactly what I needed. I laid everything out. The loan in my name, $12,000. The personal liability entirely mine. The greenhouse and fence panels, built at Diane's property under Renee's direction, with Renee using it daily. The 11 transfers totaling $4,150 from our joint account, moving money to Renee without my knowledge or consent. The October timeline that showed Renee had contracted the project before Garrett ever brought it up to me. Patricia listened with her pen moving. When I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me over her glasses. "Let's talk about what you're looking at," she said. "The loan is in your name, which means the liability is yours, regardless of what the money was used for. That's the hard part. However, if you can demonstrate that your husband directed those funds to a third party under false pretenses, that he misrepresented what the loan would be used for in order to get your signature, you have a potential claim against him for the full amount. In a divorce proceeding, that misrepresentation would factor significantly into how assets and debts are divided. I haven't decided about divorce. I understand, but I want you to know your position either way." She picked up the pen again. "The transfers from the joint account are a separate issue. Marital funds move to a third party without spousal consent. Again, in a dissolution proceeding, those funds would typically be considered dissipation of marital assets. You'd be entitled to an offset." I sat with that for a moment. "What about Renee? Directly?" Patricia tilted her head slightly. "That's more complex. She received the benefit of the loan, but she wasn't party to the agreement. If Garrett directed the funds to her knowingly, your claim is primarily against Garrett. However," she paused, "if you can show that Renee actively participated in the scheme, knowing the funds came from a loan taken in your name under false pretenses, a civil fraud claim isn't out of the question." I drove back to Pelican Cove with the windows down and the salt air coming in cold and hard. I hadn't made any decisions, but I knew what my options were now. Margot had been right about that part. Knowing your position changes everything about how you stand in a room. Garrett and I had 3 more conversations over the following 2 weeks that I would describe as genuinely honest. The kind of honest that comes too late to save something, but is still necessary for the person you're going to be afterward. He told me that Renee had approached him in September, before she'd contacted any contractors, with the greenhouse idea. She'd framed it as a gift for their mother, something to help Diane through the grief, and she'd told Garrett she had a way to fund it if he could help her work out the details. He'd known by October that the plan involved me taking out a loan. He convinced himself it was fine because Diane would benefit, because it was his family, because Renee had said I wouldn't understand the bigger picture. She said that to you more than once, I said, that I wouldn't understand. Yeah. And you never thought to wonder why your sister had such a detailed opinion about what I would and wouldn't understand? He was quiet. She's been doing this for years, Garrett. The emergency contacts, the business opinions, the financial conversations she pulled you into that I was never part of. And every time you let it happen because it was easier than pushing back on her. I know. That's the part I'm struggling with, I said. Not just the money, the years of it. He nodded. He looked tired in the way people look when they've been tired for a long time and finally stopped pretending otherwise. I know, he said again. It wasn't enough, but it was at least true. I filed for separation in mid-April. Not divorce, not yet. I needed time, and I needed to see what Garrett was actually going to do when faced with consequence, not just with conversation. I moved into a furnished rental 4 blocks from saltwater grounds, a 1-bedroom above a surf shop that smelled faintly of wax and salt, with windows that looked out over the rooftops toward the water. I took the aquarium. Garrett helped me carry it. We didn't talk much while we worked, but we were careful with the tank, both of us, the way you are with something fragile that matters. The confrontation with Renee happened in early May, and it was not what I had planned or imagined. I had planned to have it at a neutral location. I had planned to be measured and specific and to bring my documentation. What actually happened was that I ran into her at the hardware store on a Tuesday morning. She was in the paint section. I was picking up a tension rod for the rental, and we both stopped, and the aisle was too narrow, and the moment too charged for either of us to pretend it wasn't happening. "Ashley," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and has rehearsed her side of it. "Renee?" I looked at her. I had the receipts in my bag. I'd been carrying them for weeks, not because I needed them, but because having them there made me feel like I was holding something solid. "I'm not going to make a scene in a hardware store, but I need you to hear something." She straightened slightly. "Okay?" I took out a $12,000 loan in my name. I did it because my husband asked me to, and because I trusted that the money was going where he said it was going. You knew that loan existed. You knew it was in my name. You designed the project, contracted the work, and you used that greenhouse every morning. I paused. You built yourself something with my credit score and my monthly payments, and you let me believe it was something else entirely. Her chin came up. Garrett made his own decisions. He did, and he's dealing with those decisions. But I'm not talking to Garrett right now. I'm talking to you. I didn't force anyone to do anything. No. You just told your brother that I wouldn't understand the bigger picture. You said that to him in September, before any of this started. You decided what I was capable of understanding and you worked around me. I kept my voice even and clear. That's not Garrett's mistake to own a loan. That one's yours. Something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly. I don't think Renee did guilt the way most people did, but something, a recalibration. The look of someone who has been certain of their own narrative and has just heard it read back to them in a way that doesn't sound the way it did inside their head. "Mum loves that greenhouse," she said. It was all she had. "I know she does," I said. "I saw it, it's beautiful. That's what makes it complicated." I picked up the tension rod I'd been holding and stepped around her cart. "My attorney will be in touch with Garrett's about the financial settlement. I'd suggest you be ready for that conversation." I walked to the register and paid for the tension rod, and I drove back to my apartment above the surf shop, and I sat on the floor for a while and let the shaking in my hands run its course. The legal process took months, the way it always does. Patricia was thorough and patient and good at her job. In the divorce settlement, we did get to divorce, formally, by September. The greenhouse debt was classified as marital debt misrepresented to obtain my signature, and Garrett was assigned full liability for the loan repayment. The $4,150 in transfers to Renee was treated as dissipation of marital assets, and I received an equivalent offset from the equity in the house. The house sold in August. After the split, I walked away with enough to clear the loan entirely and have a cushion left over that felt, for the first time in years, like actual breathing room. Renee did not face legal action directly. Patricia had been honest with me about the difficulty of that road, and I'd thought about it for a long time. In the end, I made a different choice. I wrote Renee a letter, not a legal document, just a letter, that laid out, in plain language, exactly what she had done and what it had cost me. I mailed it to her. I don't know if she read it. I don't know if it changed anything for her. But I needed to say it in a form that existed outside my own head, and sending it felt like setting something down that I'd been carrying too long. Diane called me twice during the separation. The first time was just to say she was sorry, and she meant it, and we talked for a while about nothing in particular, her garden, the spring weather, whether the azaleas along her fence were going to bloom again this year. The second time was in July. She said she'd told Renee that she needed to take a step back from Diane's finances and daily schedule. She said she'd done it herself, not because anyone asked her to, and she said it quietly, like someone reading something off a list they'd made in the dark. I told her I thought that was the right call. I meant it. Hal, my regular at Saltwater Grounds, noticed something had shifted in me about 2 weeks after I moved into the rental. He came in at 6:45 as always, took his large dark roast with no room and said, "You look different. Not bad different, just different." "Things changed," I said. "Good change or bad change?" I thought about it. "Hard change," I said, "which usually turns out to be the necessary kind." He nodded like that made perfect sense to him, because it did. I'm still at Saltwater Grounds, still pulling shots, still opening on the cold grey mornings when the fog sits on the water until noon. I am 44 years old, and I live alone above a surf shop with an aquarium that takes up most of my living room, and 6 neon tetras and 2 angelfish, and a bristlenose pleco who works the glass like he's being paid by the hour. Some mornings, I sit with my coffee and watch the tank in the early light, and it still makes that same low bubbling sound it always did. It doesn't mock me anymore, it just sounds like what it is, a small, self-contained world where everything that lives in it is tended and fed and given clean water. That's not nothing, that's actually quite a lot. The thing about being managed, about being worked around, decided about, handled, is that it happens so gradually you stop noticing the shape of it, until the day someone hands you a receipt for a greenhouse you never agreed to, and suddenly the whole shape of years is visible at once. That was the gift, if you can call $12,000 and a divorce a gift. The shape became visible, and once you can see a thing clearly, you get to decide what to do about it. I decided.